Isaac Newton was born on December 25, 1642, in the small hamlet of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, England. The region consisted of modest farmland, rolling fields, and scattered houses separated by long stretches of quiet landscape. Newton entered the world prematurely and was described as small and fragile at birth. His father, also named Isaac Newton, had died a few months earlier, leaving his mother, Hannah Ayscough Newton, to manage the household. The early household environment was simple. Woolsthorpe Manor was an unadorned rural property with surrounding fields and orchards. Daily life followed agricultural rhythms dictated by weather and seasonal tasks. These routines created a predictable background against which Isaac spent his earliest years. When Isaac was 3 years old, his mother remarried a local clergyman, Barnabas Smith. She moved to the nearby village of North Witham, leaving Isaac to be raised by his maternal grandparents. This arrangement shaped much of Isaac's early childhood. He grew up in a quiet household where adults were occupied with farm management and daily responsibilities. Newton's relationship with his grandparents was steady, but emotionally restrained. They provided him with necessities, and he grew accustomed to long periods of solitary activity. The separation from his mother introduced a sense of distance in his early emotional life, though it unfolded gradually rather than through dramatic moments. During these years, Newton's days followed the slow pace of rural living, observing livestock in barns and fields, watching seasonal work such as harvesting and planting, wandering around the property's orchards, noticing the quiet changes in weather and light. He often spent time alone, engaging in simple experiments with objects he found, pieces of wood, bits of metal, or fragments of broken tools. These activities did not form clear scientific insight at the time, but they reflected an early interest in understanding how things moved and behaved. Newton's early education was informal and intermittent. Local schools in the area offered basic instruction, with lessons focused on reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. Teachers noted that he was quiet and observant, completing tasks with care but showing little outward enthusiasm. His handwriting practice and early copying exercises were neat and methodical. He learned gradually, absorbing information at a steady pace without drawing attention to himself. There were no signs yet of the significant mathematical ability he would later display, but his habits of careful observation and private reflection were already forming. In 1653, Newton's stepfather died, leaving his mother widowed once again. She returned to Woolsthorpe Manor with 3 younger children from her second marriage. The household became larger and more active. Isaac, now around 10 years old, was reintroduced to his mother's care, though their relationship remained reserved. His responsibilities increased slightly as he helped with small tasks around the property. These included tending animals, gathering firewood, and observing farm workers as they carried out their daily duties. He completed these tasks reliably, but without strong interest, preferring to spend time indoors or in quiet areas around the estate. During this period, Newton occasionally constructed small devices, paper lanterns, windmills, or mechanical toys. These were not sophisticated, but they hinted at an interest in mechanism and structure. He also spent time observing natural phenomena, the movement of shadows during the day, the shape of frost on windows, the way rainwater collected and flowed along the ground. These observations were quiet and private. They did not yet form scientific theories, but they revealed a disposition toward patient, solitary study. As Newton approached adolescence, his mother decided that he should resume formal education. Arrangements were made for him to attend the grammar school in Grantham, a nearby town with more structured instruction. This decision, marked the end of his early childhood in Woolsthorpe. The next chapter of his life would introduce him to a broader environment, new academic expectations, and early influences that gradually shaped his interest in mathematics and natural philosophy. Newton left Woolsthorpe with the same quiet habits he had developed there, habits of observation, contemplation, and solitary work. These would remain central to his character throughout his life. In 1654, Isaac Newton left Woolsthorpe Manor to attend the grammar school in Grantham, a modest market town located several miles from his home. The move introduced him to a more structured environment than the rural routines of his childhood. Grantham was small, but busier than Woolsthorpe, with narrow streets, a weekly market, and households engaged in various trades. Newton lodged with the Clark family, whose modest home provided him with a predictable living arrangement. He occupied a small room, kept his belongings organized, and followed the household's daily schedule with little outward complaint. Life in Grantham unfolded quietly, shaped by the steady rhythms of schooling and domestic routine. The Grantham Grammar School focused on classical education. Lessons included Latin grammar and translation writing and composition arithmetic, moral instruction based on classical texts. Students memorized passages, copied sentences carefully, and recited lessons in a disciplined manner. Newton completed these tasks with reliability, but did not stand out socially or academically at first. His teachers noted his quietness more than his achievements. Over time, he became increasingly attentive to lessons involving numbers and practical applications. Arithmetic exercises, which involved arranging figures in orderly patterns and solving simple problems, appealed to his preference for structured tasks. During his stay with the Clark family, Newton observed household routines closely. The home included a small apothecary shop, giving him exposure to jars, scales, and simple measuring tools. These items sparked his curiosity, though he interacted with them cautiously and without disrupting the household. The Clarks provided Newton with meals, lodging, and stability. He adapted to their habits, eating simple foods, observing quiet hours, and assisting with minor household chores. His daily life remained modest and consistent. Newton was not socially active. While other students engaged in games, conversation, or mischief, he often chose solitary activities, building small mechanical devices, creating drawings of objects in the house, making simple models from scraps of wood, writing notes about ideas that interested him. One remembered device was a small windmill operated by mice, a project constructed with simple materials but showing early care in mechanism and movement. These creations were not advanced, but indicated a mind drawn toward understanding physical processes. As Newton progressed through the curriculum, he became more engaged with subjects involving calculation and abstraction. He copied diagrams neatly, worked carefully through arithmetic problems, and showed patience with long exercises requiring multiple steps. His Latin studies improved gradually. Though he did not demonstrate strong literary enthusiasm, he completed translations with consistent accuracy. His handwriting became more organized, reflecting the discipline encouraged by the school. At one point, Newton's mother attempted to remove him from school so he could assist with managing the family farm at Woolsthorpe. Isaac returned home and performed agricultural tasks, tending animals, keeping basic records, observing farm workers, measuring small areas of land. However, he showed little interest in farming. His work was competent, but lacked enthusiasm. He spent much of his free time reading or building small devices, rather than focusing on agricultural responsibilities. His mother eventually recognized that his skills were better suited to study, and she permitted him to return to Grantham. This decision marked an important step in the gradual shaping of Newton's academic path. Upon returning to Grantham, Newton approached his studies with increased seriousness. He kept notebooks in which he recorded observations, copied phrases, and worked through problems. His teachers noticed his growing dedication, though he remained socially reserved and maintained a quiet presence among peers. He also began reading beyond the prescribed curriculum, exploring books borrowed from the Clark household or recommended by instructors. These texts introduced him to broader ideas in mathematics and natural philosophy. As Newton neared the end of his schooling, discussions emerged about sending him to Cambridge University. His teachers recognized his developing abilities, particularly in arithmetic and independent study. The decision required financial arrangements, which were made possible through his status as a subsizar, a student who performed modest duties in exchange for reduced expenses. By 1661, plans were finalized, and Newton prepared to enter Trinity College. His years in Grantham had shaped his habits of careful study, quiet observation, and solitary work, traits that would define his academic life. Leaving Grantham marked the end of Newton's early education. He departed the town with increased curiosity and the beginnings of intellectual direction. Ahead lay a new environment, one that would offer him access to broader ideas, new texts, and opportunities to explore the questions that had quietly taken shape during his school years. The next chapter would follow his steady immersion into the academic life of Cambridge University. In June 1661, Isaac Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, to begin his university studies at the age of 18. Cambridge at this time was a quiet institution, shaped by traditional instruction and routine academic exercises. The college buildings consisted of stone courts, narrow staircases, and modest rooms where students lived, studied, and attended lectures. Newton entered as a subsizar, meaning he supported his education by performing small duties, cleaning rooms, serving wealthier students, or assisting with basic tasks around the college. This arrangement allowed him to pursue his studies with reduced expenses. It also reinforced habits of modest living and quiet observation that had characterized his life so far. The academic life at Cambridge followed a predictable rhythm: morning prayers, lectures on classical texts, tutorials in small groups, assigned readings, evening study periods. The curriculum heavily emphasized Aristotelian philosophy, classical authors, and formal logic. Students memorized sections of established texts and participated in exercises designed to build argumentative skill. Newton attended these sessions dutifully, but did not find them intellectually stimulating. He completed assignments with care while privately seeking material beyond the traditional curriculum. Although official instruction relied on established classical authors, Cambridge libraries also contained newer works by modern thinkers. During his first years, Newton explored these texts quietly and without drawing attention. He read René Descartes, whose mathematical approach to philosophy influenced him, Johannes Kepler, whose ideas on planetary motion he studied carefully, Galileo Galilei, whose experiments and writings on motion attracted his interest, William Oughtred, whose mathematical works provided him with new methods. Newton often copied passages by hand, filled notebooks with diagrams, and worked through mathematical problems in private. These early studies were not yet connected into a unified theory. They represented independent exploration, guided by curiosity rather than a specific objective. Newton lived in a small, sparsely furnished room at Trinity. His daily habits remained simple: eating modest meals at prescribed times, attending prayers and lectures, regularly reading late into the night, writing notes in a systematic, organized manner, maintaining limited social interaction. He avoided disruptive behavior and kept to himself. While other students participated in discussions, arguments, or games, Newton focused on reading and private study. By 1663, Newton began keeping notebooks in which he recorded mathematical ideas, mechanical questions, and reflections on scientific topics. These notebooks included early notes on infinite series, geometric problems, principles of motion, optical experiments. The entries were written carefully, with diagrams placed neatly next to explanations. These private documents revealed his emerging interest in subjects that would later occupy much of his life. Cambridge began to see the influence of more modern scientific ideas during Newton's time there. Some lecturers introduced concepts drawn from new works circulating among scholars. Newton attended these sessions attentively. He did not participate actively in discussion, but he noted arguments, compared ideas, and revised his personal notebooks accordingly. He also observed scientific demonstrations conducted by tutors or visiting scholars, taking careful notice of the behavior of light, motion, and mechanical devices. As Newton advanced through his studies, he fulfilled the academic requirements of the university. Attending disputations, completing assigned readings, maintaining orderly conduct, preparing for examinations. His progress was steady. He was not yet recognized as an exceptional student publicly, but his private efforts exceeded the expectations of the formal curriculum. By 1664, Newton's reading expanded to include works on mathematics beyond standard university texts. He began creating methods and solving problems not assigned by instructors. This period marked the beginning of what he later referred to as his initiation into mathematics. He wrote early versions of ideas related to calculus, although he did not yet formalize them. In 1665, the Great Plague reached Cambridge, prompting the university to close temporarily. Students were instructed to leave and continue their studies elsewhere. Newton prepared to return to Woolsthorpe Manor, carrying with him notebooks, texts, and questions he intended to explore independently. The move would unexpectedly provide him with uninterrupted time to develop ideas that had begun forming during his Cambridge years. This transition marked the beginning of the most productive period of Newton's early intellectual life. In 1665, the Great Plague reached Cambridge, prompting the university to suspend lectures and close its buildings for an extended period. Students were instructed to leave the city for their safety. Isaac Newton, now in his early 20s, returned to Woolsthorpe Manor, the rural home where he had spent his early childhood. This unexpected relocation marked the beginning of a quiet, largely solitary period in which Newton continued his studies independently. Without formal instruction or academic obligations, he relied on the books and notes he brought with him. The environment at Woolsthorpe was calm, isolated, and predictable, conditions that allowed him to think deeply about problems he had begun exploring at Cambridge. Woolsthorpe Manor remained much as it had during Newton's childhood. The surrounding fields, orchards, and stone buildings formed a tranquil environment. Daily rural activities continued at a slow pace, with workers tending animals and managing the property through ordinary routines. Newton lived quietly within this familiar setting. Most days involved a consistent pattern: reviewing his notebooks, performing small mathematical calculations, examining natural phenomena outdoors, recording observations in an orderly fashion. He had few interruptions, allowing his studies to proceed steadily. During these years, Newton made significant progress in mathematics. Working alone at a small desk in Woolsthorpe, he developed methods for handling changing quantities, ideas that would later contribute to what became known as calculus. These early mathematical concepts were recorded in notebooks as sequences of problems, diagrams, and tentative rules. Newton wrote cautiously, refining steps and adjusting notations. The work was private and did not take the form of a systematic treatise, but it reflected deep engagement with patterns and relationships he had begun to explore at Cambridge. Newton also performed simple experiments with light during this period. Using glass prisms he had acquired earlier, he examined how sunlight passing through a prism separated into colors. He observed the behavior of the colored bands and noted the consistency of the effect. These experiments were conducted in a quiet room, with sunlight admitted through small openings. Newton's observations formed the foundation of ideas he would later develop into a more formal theory of light. At the time, however, he simply recorded the results and attempted to interpret them with care. The rural environment offered opportunities for observing physical processes, the fall of objects, the movement of shadows, the path of the sun across the orchard water, flowing through small channels in the fields. Newton watched these phenomena without haste, making notes when something caught his attention. These observations contributed indirectly to his developing ideas about motion and forces. During his time in Woolsthorpe, Newton considered questions related to the motion of bodies and the forces acting upon them. He worked through problems involving circular motion, inertia, and trajectories. The period produced preliminary insights into what he later formulated as the law of universal gravitation. His thoughts at this stage were exploratory rather than complete. He wrote notes that compared the motion of planets with falling bodies, attempting to understand whether a common principle might connect them. The well-known story of an apple falling in the orchard belongs to this period, though contemporary descriptions present it simply as a moment of reflection rather than an extraordinary event. Newton incorporated such observations into his broader contemplation of natural principles. Newton's routine during these years was characterized by long stretches of uninterrupted work. He often spent entire days studying indoors, interrupted only by simple meals or brief walks. His family members continued their daily tasks without much involvement in his studies. This period of isolation did not involve dramatic breakthroughs, but consisted of slow, steady accumulation of ideas. Newton later regarded these years as foundational because they allowed him to think without external distractions. By 1667, the plague had subsided, and Cambridge University reopened. Newton returned to Trinity College, carrying with him the notebooks, diagrams, and early ideas developed during his time at Woolsthorpe. His independent work had expanded significantly, though he did not immediately present it publicly. Instead, he resumed academic duties quietly, preparing for the next stage of his life: formal research, teaching, and eventual recognition within the university. The calm years in Woolsthorpe had shaped much of the intellectual foundation on which his later achievements would rest. When Isaac Newton returned to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1667, the university had resumed its normal routines after the disruption caused by the plague. Students and faculty returned gradually, and academic life began to restore its usual order. Newton, older and more intellectually focused than before, settled quietly back into the environment he had left 2 years earlier. He brought with him a substantial collection of notes from his time in Woolsthorpe, papers filled with mathematical problems, optical observations, and early ideas on motion. These manuscripts were personal and had not been shared publicly, but they reflected a period of concentrated study that would soon influence his academic path. In 1667, shortly after his return, Newton was elected a Fellow of Trinity College. This position provided modest financial support and required adherence to college regulations, including attendance at services and periodic examinations. As a fellow, Newton had a stable residence within the college and access to its libraries. His responsibilities included assisting with academic duties, maintaining orderly conduct, participating in university exercises. The fellowship offered continuity and allowed him to continue his studies without financial strain. Newton spent much of his initial time back at Cambridge, reviewing the work he had done at Woolsthorpe. He organized his notebooks, copied passages cleanly, and refined calculations. This process helped him clarify the direction of his research. His notebooks now contained detailed mathematical methods related to fluxions, early calculus, records of prism experiments, reflections on planetary motion mechanical diagrams. He continued to expand and revise these notes in a careful, methodical manner. In 1669, Newton's academic trajectory changed when he succeeded Isaac Barrow as Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. The position was one of the most respected mathematical chairs in Europe, though Newton entered it with little public recognition. His appointment followed Barrow's recommendation, based on private review of Newton's work. Newton accepted the position quietly and prepared to deliver lectures as required. As Lucasian professor, Newton was responsible for delivering a series of lectures each term. He wrote these lectures carefully, often focusing on topics related to optics and geometry. Although the lectures were formally prepared, attendance was small. Few students were interested in advanced mathematics, and Newton's teaching style remained precise and reserved. Nevertheless, the lectures provided an avenue for developing his ideas and presenting them in structured form. Newton resumed his optical studies with renewed focus. Using prisms, lenses, and small apertures, he examined the behavior of light in greater detail. He refined his earlier observations from Woolsthorpe and developed a theory that white light was composed of various colors that could be separated and recombined. These experiments were conducted in modest rooms at Trinity using controlled lighting conditions. Newton kept careful records, noting angles, positions, and observations with precision. In 1672, Newton decided to share some of his optical findings with the Royal Society, a leading scientific institution in London. He sent a paper presenting his experiments on light and color. The Royal Society received the paper positively, initiating correspondence between Newton and its members. This marked the beginning of his public scientific reputation. Although the interactions were polite, they introduced Newton to the broader scientific community and opened new channels for discussion. By 1672, Newton had established himself at Cambridge, organized and expanded his private research, begun presenting ideas to the Royal Society, taken initial steps toward public recognition. These developments occurred gradually. Newton remained reserved, focused on his work, and hesitant to engage broadly with scientific debate. But the foundations had been laid for his increasing influence in the years ahead. The next chapter would trace his deeper involvement with optics, his initial scientific disputes, and the quiet expansion of his reputation. Newton's decision in 1672 to share his optical research with the Royal Society marked the beginning of a new phase in his academic life. Until this point, most of his work had remained private, developed quietly through independent study. The publication of his first optical paper introduced him to a broader scientific audience and gradually drew him into discussions that extended beyond the quiet routine of Cambridge. This chapter follows his increasing visibility, the steady development of his ideas, and the slow emergence of tensions that accompanied public scientific debate. Newton's initial paper to the Royal Society explained his prism experiments, describing how white light could be separated into distinct colors and then recombined. The experiments were simple but carefully arranged. A narrow beam of sunlight, a glass prism placed at a precise angle, a screen to receive the separated colors measurements of each band's position and width. The clarity of the results attracted attention. Members of the Royal Society expressed interest, and the paper was formally published. This marked Newton's first public scientific contribution. Following publication, several members of the Society sent questions requesting clarification. They asked about the nature of color, the role of the prism, and the interpretation of the results. Newton responded patiently at first, writing detailed explanations and providing additional diagrams. These exchanges introduced him to a new aspect of scientific work: public scrutiny. While Newton approached the questions carefully, he found extended debate uncomfortable. The process required steady communication, which contrasted with his preference for private study and quiet reflection. As correspondence continued, some scientists proposed alternative explanations for the prism results. Others suggested modifications to his experiments. None of the disagreements were hostile, but they required Newton to defend and restate his conclusions repeatedly. Over time, Newton became increasingly reluctant to engage. He maintained polite correspondence, but grew wary of prolonged debate. Instead of publishing additional work promptly, he began withholding research, choosing to keep much of his thinking private. Despite this reserved approach, his reputation continued to grow. Scholars across England and Europe became aware of his optical experiments and mathematical skill. During this period, Newton also constructed a reflecting telescope, using a metal mirror rather than a lens to form images. The design minimized chromatic aberration, an issue he connected to the nature of light uncovered through his prism experiments. The telescope attracted interest because of its compact size and clear image quality. Newton sent a model to the Royal Society, where it was examined and approved. This contribution strengthened his standing within the scientific community. Although Newton's recognition grew, he became steadily more cautious about engaging with critics. He preferred to work independently, refining his manuscripts and calculations without immediate publication. During these years, he continued prism experiments, mathematical development studies of celestial motion, mechanical investigations, but much of this work remained within his private notebooks. Between 1675 and 1684, Newton devoted increasing attention to problems related to motion and planetary orbits. He studied the works of Kepler and Galileo, comparing theoretical predictions with observed data. He worked through problems related to elliptical orbits, centripetal forces, velocity changes, the inverse square relationship. These ideas grew gradually, refined through calculations and diagrams. Newton did not yet prepare them for publication, focusing instead on verifying each step carefully. Newton maintained membership in the Royal Society and continued to receive letters from other scientists. While cordial, his contributions during this period were limited. He responded to inquiries selectively and refrained from sending new major papers. He preferred to observe the Society's activities from a distance, focusing on his own research. His reputation remained strong despite his limited participation. In August 1684, the astronomer Edmund Halley visited Newton at Cambridge to discuss the problem of planetary motion. Halley sought a mathematical explanation for the observed orbits described by Kepler's laws. Newton responded that he had already worked out a solution some years earlier. This meeting marked an important transition. Halley's encouragement led Newton to gather his scattered notes, refine his calculations, and begin preparing a comprehensive mathematical treatment of motion and gravity. Though modest in its immediate impact, this conversation would eventually lead to the creation of Newton's most significant scientific work. By 1684, Newton's reputation in optics was well established, and he had developed substantial private work in mathematics and mechanics. The years ahead would involve the careful organization of these ideas into a unified framework. a task that required patience, structure, and a willingness to engage with the scientific community once again. The next chapter would follow the writing and publication of Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, a turning point that grew not from sudden inspiration, but from years of steady, quiet refinement. The meeting with Edmund Halley in 1684 marked the beginning of a new phase in Isaac Newton's work. Although Newton had studied problems of motion and gravity privately for many years, he had not organized his results into a systematic form. Halley's visit and his steady encouragement prompted Newton to assemble his earlier notes and develop them into a comprehensive treatise. The process unfolded gradually, shaped by Newton's methodical habits and preference for working in private. After their conversation, Halley requested that Newton send him a written demonstration of the mathematical relationship underlying planetary motion. Newton provided a short manuscript outlining key arguments regarding centripetal force and orbital paths. Halley recognized the significance of this work and encouraged Newton to expand it. He offered to oversee the publication process, relieving Newton of logistical concerns. Encouraged by this support, Newton began assembling a larger manuscript that drew from years of private calculations. This early encouragement formed the basis for a much more extensive project, the creation of a unified mathematical description of motion. Newton now worked systematically to gather the ideas he had developed over time: notes on falling bodies, diagrams of curved trajectories, calculations involving inverse square relationships, reflections on inertia and force. He sorted these notes, revised earlier arguments, and wrote new sections to connect ideas. His work was careful and deliberate, expanding slowly into a larger treatise. During this period, Newton withdrew further from social activity. He spent long hours alone in his rooms at Trinity College, writing steadily and revising proofs until he was satisfied with their clarity. Between 1685 and 1686, Newton composed the 3 books that would form Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, often referred to simply as the Principia. The structure developed in a calm and logical sequence. Book I defined fundamental concepts such as mass, force, and acceleration, presented mathematical laws of motion, demonstrated how forces affect bodies in motion. Book II addressed motion in resisting media, examined problems related to fluids and drag, provided mathematical descriptions of resistance. Book III applied the principles from the first 2 books to celestial bodies, described the motion of planets, moons, and comets, presented the law of universal gravitation. Newton wrote each section carefully, verifying calculations and refining diagrams. He sought precision, clarity, and internal consistency rather than stylistic flourish. Edmund Halley played an essential role during this process. He visited Newton periodically, clarified points of presentation, and oversaw arrangements with printers. He also managed financial matters when difficulties arose, ensuring that production continued smoothly. Newton appreciated Halley's support, responding with steady progress on the manuscript. Their collaboration remained cordial, grounded in mutual respect for scientific work. When the manuscript neared completion, manuscript sections were shared with members of the Royal Society. Reactions were respectful and attentive. Scholars recognized the mathematical rigor of the work, though some acknowledged its difficulty. The Society supported its publication, and the printing process began under Halley's supervision. In 1687, the Principia was published. The book presented a unified system linking terrestrial motion and celestial motion through mathematical laws. Although Newton did not seek public acclaim, the publication established him as one of the foremost intellectual figures of his time. The reception was gradual. Scholars read and discuss the ideas, integrating them into their own work. The methods and conclusions influenced mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, though the full impact unfolded over many years. Following the completion of the Principia, Newton returned to his routine at Cambridge. He, continued teaching, oversaw his responsibilities as Lucasian professor, maintained correspondence with select colleagues, reflected on possible extensions of his work. The publication did not significantly alter his daily habits. He approached the next years with the same quiet discipline that had characterized his earlier studies. With the Principia, Newton's long period of private contemplation reached its most complete expression. His ideas had moved from notebooks and solitary calculations to a structured public work. The next chapter of his life would involve administrative responsibilities and new roles outside the academic sphere, marking a shift in the shape of his daily activities. In 1696, Isaac Newton accepted a position outside the academic environment that had shaped most of his adult life. He was appointed Warden of the Royal Mint in London, a role involving administrative duties rather than scientific research. The transition marked a shift from university routines to the practical management of currency and national finances. Newton left Cambridge and moved to London, settling into new habits shaped by the daily operations of the Mint. His work in this period was defined by careful organization, steady oversight, and gradual reforms aimed at improving the nation's coinage. London presented a different environment from the quiet colleges of Cambridge. The city was larger, busier, and more crowded, with markets, workshops, and government buildings forming its central districts. Newton adapted to these surroundings with his usual reserve, maintaining modest routines and focusing on administrative responsibilities. As warden, his duties included supervising the production of coins, ensuring the accuracy of weights and metals, maintaining records, overseeing staff and contractors. He approached each task with methodical attention, reviewing paperwork carefully and observing procedures without unnecessary intervention. One of Newton's major responsibilities involved the Great Recoinage of 1696, a nationwide effort to replace older, clipped, and worn coins with newly minted ones. The older silver coins in circulation had become severely reduced in weight due to clipping, a practice in which small pieces of silver were cut from the edges. Newton's role required organizing the collection of old coins, supervising the melting and reminting process, coordinating with regional mints, maintaining accurate accounts of metal quantities and output. This work demanded patience and precision. Newton monitored progress through reports, conducted inspections, and ensured that each stage proceeded according to established standards. Over time, Newton introduced improvements aimed at increasing consistency and reducing inefficiency within the Mint. These included clarifying work procedures, reorganizing storage, standardizing tools and equipment, reducing errors in measurement. These adjustments were incremental rather than sweeping. Newton preferred steady refinement of existing practices, ensuring that the system operated predictably. As warden, Newton was also responsible for prosecuting cases of counterfeiting, a serious crime at the time. Although he was reluctant to engage in legal conflicts, he carried out these duties with diligence. He reviewed evidence, interviewed individuals involved in mint operations, and supported legal proceedings. His involvement was procedural, focused on records and verification rather than dramatic confrontation. Newton's time at the Mint left little opportunity for scientific investigation. His workdays were filled with administrative tasks, reports, and meetings with officials. Although he maintained interest in mathematics and natural philosophy, he published little during these years. Nevertheless, He kept notebooks at home where he occasionally recorded thoughts on optical questions, revisions to existing work, small mechanical problems, clerical notes for future organization. These entries reflected his tendency to maintain long-term projects even during periods of administrative responsibility. The position at the Mint provided Newton with greater financial security than he had enjoyed at Cambridge. His salary and accommodations allowed for a more comfortable standard of living, and he managed his expenses carefully. This stability contributed to a quieter personal life in London with regular routines and predictable obligations. In 1699, Newton was promoted to Master of the Mint, a position with greater authority and responsibility. Unlike the warden's role, which was partially supervisory, the mastership required direct oversight of production, accounting, and policy. Newton accepted the promotion without ceremony. His increased duties included managing the Mint's finances, overseeing coin design and standards, supervising daily operations, ensuring compliance with government regulations. He approached the expanded role with the same steady discipline that characterized his earlier work. Between 1699 and 1703, Newton continued attending meetings with Treasury officials, reviewing reports, overseeing reforms, maintaining steady correspondence, managing the steady production of coinage. These tasks occupied much of his time. His interactions with government officials were polite and structured, reflecting his preference for orderly conduct. Despite his administrative focus, Newton remained connected to the scientific community through occasional correspondence with members of the Royal Society. His reputation from the Principia continued to grow quietly in the background. This gradual recognition would eventually lead to a new phase of his life, one in which he returned to a more prominent role in scientific leadership. In 1703, Isaac Newton was elected President of the Royal Society, the foremost scientific institution in England. The position marked a return to visible scientific leadership after years spent primarily in administrative work at the Mint. Newton accepted the role with reserved formality, continuing to maintain quiet personal habits while taking on new responsibilities in the organization. This period of his life involved oversight of scientific discussions, management of publications, and gradual refinement of earlier research. Newton's election followed the death of Robert Hooke, who had previously held a central place in the Society's activities. Newton's reputation, strengthened by the Principia and his long association with the Royal Society, made him a respected candidate. As president, Newton presided over meetings, managed correspondence, and oversaw the Society's decisions regarding scientific papers and publications. He approached these duties with consistent attention to procedure, ensuring that records were maintained and discussions proceeded in an orderly manner. Weekly meetings of the Royal Society included presentation of new scientific findings, reports from members, discussions of ongoing experiments, decisions about publications. Newton guided these sessions calmly, allowing members to speak while keeping the proceedings structured. He reviewed submitted papers, made recommendations, and ensured that each contribution followed the Society's standards. His leadership emphasized organization and clarity rather than dramatic intervention. One of Newton's responsibilities involved overseeing the publication of scientific works supported by the Society. He encouraged careful review and ensured that discussions remained grounded in evidence. During this period, he supported publications in fields such as astronomy, mathematics, optics, natural philosophy. Newton did not impose his own ideas, but offered steady guidance to maintain the Society's credibility and precision. Between 1704 and 1713, Newton worked intermittently on revisions to the Principia. With the assistance of mathematician Roger Coates, He reviewed earlier arguments, corrected minor errors, and expanded certain sections. The revision process included clarifying mathematical demonstrations, adding notes and commentary, incorporating additional observations, improving the structure of some arguments. The second edition was published in 1713. It preserved the original framework while providing refinements that made certain passages more accessible to scholars. In 1704, Newton published Optics, a work based on his earlier optical experiments. Unlike the mathematically dense Principia, Optics presented observations and conclusions in a more descriptive style. The book included detailed descriptions of prism experiments, studies of color, and refraction discussions of light's behavior in various media, a series of queries posing questions about natural phenomena. The publication was well received and contributed to a renewed interest in optical science. Newton prepared the work carefully, drawing directly from experiments he had conducted many years earlier. As president, Newton maintained regular correspondence with scholars across Europe. Letters discussed astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, new scientific instruments, questions related to ongoing research. Newton responded with restraint, offering guidance or clarification when needed. His role as a respected senior figure brought many inquiries, which he addressed with steady attention. During these years, Newton received increasing public recognition. He was consulted on scientific matters, honored by academic institutions, and regarded as one of the leading thinkers of his generation. Despite this recognition, Newton maintained simple personal routines. His days were divided between mint responsibilities, Royal Society duties, and occasional work on manuscripts. By 1720, Newton had established himself firmly as a senior figure in English science and public administration. His work at the Mint continued, and his leadership of the Royal Society remained stable. The next phase of his life would shift gradually toward quieter years, focused on reflection, revisions of manuscripts, and a slow reduction of public duties. By 1720, Isaac Newton was in his late 70s. His responsibilities at the Royal Mint and the Royal Society continued, but his pace gradually slowed. His days followed orderly routines, shaped by decades of administrative and intellectual discipline. These final years were marked by steady reflection, care for his physical condition, and quiet attention to unfinished manuscripts. In his older age, Newton continued to serve as Master of the Mint, overseeing its operations, President of the Royal Society, presiding over meetings, a respected advisor in matters of science and government. However, he delegated more tasks than before. Reports were reviewed more slowly, correspondence answered at a steadier pace, and participation in discussions became less frequent. Despite reduced activity, Newton remained attentive to the broader direction of the institutions he led. Newton lived primarily in London during these years, in a quiet residence that accommodated his administrative duties and allowed for a modest level of comfort. His routine was structured and consistent. Mornings devoted to reviewing correspondence or documents, afternoons spent in meetings or reading, evenings reserved for rest or simple study. He preferred regular meals, predictable schedules, and a calm environment. Newton's health declined slowly but steadily. He experienced episodes of gout, digestive discomfort, stiffness from age, reduced stamina for travel. These conditions did not prevent him from fulfilling his duties, but they influenced his daily habits. He avoided long journeys and spent more time seated while working through documents. Medical practices of the time offered limited remedies, so Newton managed his health primarily through rest and moderation. Even in later life, Newton maintained interest in his earlier works. He reviewed notes, prepared small additions, and considered revisions to existing texts. He returned occasionally to topics such as chronology, natural philosophy, biblical interpretations, mechanical problems. Although he no longer produced major scientific works, he continued to refine ideas that had occupied him throughout his life. His approach remained cautious. He preferred to clarify existing arguments rather than introduce entirely new ones. Newton received visitors who sought advice, clarification, or conversation regarding scientific and administrative matters. These included scholars, government officials, and members of the Royal Society. His responses were calm and measured. Conversations tended to focus on scientific publications, recent observations, institutional matters, historical topics. Newton remained patient but reserved, maintaining the polite formality for which he was known. During these years, Newton continued to attend meetings at the Royal Society when health permitted. His presence provided continuity and stability for the organization. He also remained involved in mint policy, offering guidance on standardization and procedure. His contributions were practical rather than innovative, reflecting a lifetime of administrative experience. In early 1727, Newton's health deteriorated more noticeably. He experienced severe pain from gout and increasing weakness. He reduced his activities significantly, spending most of his time resting in his residence. During this period, he organized his personal papers, attended to financial matters, and ensured that his affairs were in order. He remained mentally attentive, reviewing documents and speaking with those close to him. Isaac Newton passed away on March 20th, 1727, at the age of 84. Newton was buried in Westminster Abbey, a mark of national recognition for his contributions to science and public service. Scholars across Europe reflected on his work, acknowledging his influence on mathematics, mechanics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. His legacy developed gradually, shaped by the continued study of the Principia, the impact of optics, his administrative reforms, the enduring presence of his methods in scientific practice. Newton's life closed with the same steady discipline that had guided it from childhood, a consistent commitment to careful thought, quiet work, and precise understanding. Isaac Newton's life unfolded without dramatic interruptions. From his early years in Woolsthorpe to his final days in London, the pattern remained consistent. Steady habits, careful work, and patient attention to detail. Nothing in his upbringing suggested the scale of his later influence. He developed gradually, through years of private study and quiet observation. His greatest ideas emerged not from sudden excitement, but from long periods of uninterrupted thought. First in the small rooms of Cambridge, then during the stillness of the plague years, and later through structured revisions of earlier notes. Newton's major works, the Principia and Optics, were built slowly, one calculation and one observation at a time. Even his administrative duties at the Mint and the Royal Society followed the same pattern: organization, routine, and clarity. In his final years, he approached aging with the same calm discipline, reviewing old manuscripts, responding to letters, and fulfilling obligations as health allowed. His death in 1727 marked the close of a long life shaped by consistency rather than spectacle. Today, Newton is remembered not only for the mathematical laws that transformed science, but for the method by which he arrived at them, through patience, careful study, and a steady commitment to understanding. His biography, viewed as a whole, reflects a life where progress came quietly, built on years of solitary work and gradual refinement. It is this steady persistence that forms the lasting character of Isaac Newton's story.